Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's program. My name is Niamh King. I'm the Vice President for Programs and Strategic Content here at the Chicago Council. We're delighted to welcome Sir Alan Duncan here tonight and honoured to host him on our platform. A big thanks out to the staff at the British Consulate. Thank you so much for your assistance with this program. And also this evening in the audience is the British Ambassador to Venezuela, who will soon be joining us, John Saville is his name, as the Consul General in Chicago. So we're delighted to have him too. So special thanks to Martin, Eric and Kaylee at the Consulate for organising the Minister's visit. As many of you may know, the Council is a membership organisation, and membership has benefits like you got to get tickets early for Joe Biden. I would encourage you to join, become a member if you'd like for $100. That's what it starts at. And you may have noticed our programs times are starting differently. 5:30 they start instead of 6. We're ending at 6:30, and please feel free to join other people from the program for a drink afterwards. That the bar is open. We welcome your engagement on social media, but please make sure that the sound on your phones are turned off. I'll be taking questions later from the audience to go to the Minister. A few moments on his introduction, please. His name is Sir Alan Duncan. He's the Minister of State for Europe and the Americas in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office of the United Kingdom. He's been elected a Conservative MP since 1992. He previously served as Minister of State for International Development from 2010 to 2014. He studied politics and economics at St. John's College in Oxford and went on to be a Kennedy Scholar at Harvard University. And please join me in welcoming Sir Alan Duncan to the stage of the Council. Thank you.
Well, good evening, and thank you for your warm introduction. And I'm delighted, actually, to be back in the States and to have the opportunity to speak to such a distinguished and well-informed audience, something always rather daunting for a politician when it comes to questions. And you're rather more deeply informed, I suspect, than the Chicagoan who responded to a survey a few years ago on how the British are perceived by other countries. And his answer was, better dressed than the Americans, but with very bad teeth. So I'm pleased to see in your most recent survey what Americans think about America First, that Americans consider the UK to be the most responsible country in dealing with the world's problems. Well, I know that in a few days you're holding an event which poses the question, is this the end of the transatlantic era? Well, I'm sorry I wasn't able to accept your invitation to speak then as well, but I do think that that question is a good one to start with this evening. And the short answer to it, from the UK perspective, is no. Now, the most mentioned word of the year is probably Brexit. And the British exit from the EU poses millions of questions about what effect it will have on so many established relationships. And the point is this: the UK is leaving the European Union, but it remains a global player in its own right and one with global interests. And Brexit does not mean that we're stepping back from the world. And that would be to misunderstand the choice made by the British public, as our Prime Minister, Theresa May, made clear in her speech last month in Italy. When the British people voted last year, their decision was based on a desire for more direct democratic control, and they felt that that was something that was being lost in the pooling of sovereignty that the membership of the European Union requires. So their vote was actually an expression of how they want their democracy to work. But the referendum most definitely was not about calling into question the UK's role as a globally active country. Indeed, for all their differences on everything else, the importance of the UK's global role was one point around which both the Leave and the Remain campaigns converged. Now, there's a reason for this consensus. In today's interconnected world, no one in the UK seriously believes that it makes sense to turn inwards. Promoting free trade, protecting the rules-based international order, and enhancing global development are all in our national interest. Terrorism, crime, and climate change respect no borders. And we must work in partnership with others to address all of these issues and more besides. We also strongly believe that the UK has much to contribute to international efforts to tackle these challenges in our immediate neighbourhood and actually more widely. In our neighbourhood, that means continuing to work closely with the EU in those areas where our interests are strategically aligned. And as the Prime Minister said, we're leaving the EU, but we still very much want it to succeed because we believe deeply in the same values: peace, democracy, freedom, and the rule of law in our continent and beyond it. And that's why we want to build a deep and special partnership with the EU, and why we want to continue to play a leading role in advancing European prosperity and security, as we set out for the EU to see last month in what we called our future partnership paper on foreign policy, defence, security and development. And our ambition is to agree a comprehensive new framework for future security, law enforcement and criminal justice cooperation between the EU and the UK. And this framework would be underpinned by our shared values, including high standards of data protection and human rights. And we want to work together to protect our continent from shared threats. Now, beyond our immediate neighbourhood, the same logic applies. It is emphatically in our interests to reach out beyond our shores, as we've always done, to protect and promote our interests and values. The United Kingdom is a permanent member of the Security Council, a leading member of NATO, the G7, the G20, and the Commonwealth, and we have the largest defence budget in Europe. We're the only European country to meet both the NATO target of spending 2% of GDP on defence and the UN target of spending 0.7% of our gross national income on international development. And after we leave the EU, we will continue to promote and defend our values through our global diplomatic network, our development assistance programs, and our military muscle. And NATO will remain the cornerstone of our defence, and we will continue to champion the United Nations and to be a leading voice in other international organisations. So in short, once the UK leaves the EU, our defence and security, overseas aid and foreign policy will continue to reflect our proud history as a global power with global interests, and to demonstrate our ongoing commitment to promoting security and prosperity and an international rules-based order across the world. Now, our relationship with the United States remains absolutely fundamental to that approach. The US and the UK are natural partners and natural allies. Our relationship is based on shared values and a commitment to freedom, democracy, and enterprise. And we actually do more together than any other two countries in the world, working side by side on security and defence, and on trade, and on investment, and on research and innovation. And in the UK, 1 million people go to work every day for US companies, and a similar number of Americans work for UK companies based here in the United States. Now, ours is a relationship that continues to strengthen and deepen with the passage of time. And a good example of that is the recent agreement on a new UK-US special relationship on science, which will encourage the freer exchange of scientists and scientific equipment. And just last week, the British government pledged $88 million to one of the first projects under the agreement, based at Fermilab, just outside Chicago. Now, US and UK scientists will be pooling their brainpower, I'm told, to find out more about neutrinos. Now, I'm not exactly Justin Trudeau, so I'm not going to surprise you with a lesson on subatomic particles. But suffice to say, they're of great interest to scientists, and I hope that this project will prove to be the first of many. Now, the special relationship between our countries also means that when we have differences, we can air them frankly. And the administration's position on the Paris Climate Change Agreement is a case in point. We have made clear that the UK remains committed to the Paris Agreement and that we believe it provides the right framework for global action on the issue. I just met Mayor Emmanuel, and we discussed this city's efforts to tackle climate change. And we're looking forward to working with Chicago and cities across the US in our joint endeavor to reduce emissions. And policy differences on some areas do not prevent us from working closely on others. And I would like to highlight three clear and present foreign policy challenges on which the UK and the US will need to continue to work closely. The first is North Korea. Its reckless pursuit of nuclear and ballistic missile capabilities violates multiple UN Security Council resolutions and poses a grave threat to global peace and stability. And as our Prime Minister said last month in New York, time and again, Kim Jong-un has shown contempt not only for the rules and institutions that underpin global security and prosperity, but also for the safety of his neighbors. Now, we want a peaceful solution to this crisis. North Korea must stop the tests and return to the negotiating table, prepared to work towards dismantling its illegal nuclear programs. For its part, the US has given the DPRK very clear and public assurances. It's not seeking regime collapse or change, or the early reunification of the Korean Peninsula. It is not seeking an excuse to garrison US troops north of the 38th parallel. It wishes no harm to the long-suffering North Korean people. Yet the DPRK has responded to those assurances with yet more missile tests and another nuclear test. And this is why we must all apply maximum political and economic pressure to persuade the leadership in Pyongyang to change its ways. Now, China has significant economic leverage. So we continue to encourage Beijing to use that leverage to bring Kim to the table. And in fact, Europe could also do more. The UK has led calls for additional EU sanctions that go further than those agreed in UN Security Council Resolution 2375. And we hope that the European Council later this month will give final approval for these. They would send an important message of international unity, and that unity is crucial. Indeed, on this issue, we can only succeed by working together. The second major foreign policy challenge is Iran. Now, I want to make it absolutely clear that in our view, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, is the best way to address Iran's nuclear issue. We are now much further away from a nuclear crisis than we were before the deal. Iran has made significant progress in rolling back its nuclear program and in limiting its nuclear capability. The International Atomic Energy Agency has unprecedented access. Indeed, no other state is subject to such intrusive monitoring. And we want to maintain the benefits of the deal while also addressing areas of concern that it does not cover, such as Iran's interference in other countries. Now, we judge that Iran is in compliance with the JCPOA and that decertifying would make it harder to address these other concerns and to constrain Iran's nuclear program. And if anyone is still in any doubts of the benefits of the deal, just imagine for a moment that it no longer existed. We could then be facing not just one nuclear crisis in North Korea, but two. And that puts the importance of this deal into perspective. It was the culmination of 13 years of diplomacy and brought parties to the table in a way that would previously have been impossible. And that's why we strongly urge the President and Congress to stick with the devil we know and recertify, while being tough and vigilant in its implementation. Now, the third major foreign policy challenge is Russia. Russia has become more aggressive, more authoritarian, and more nationalist. It increasingly defines itself in opposition to the West. Its actions not only threaten its closest neighbors, but we also have serious concerns about its illegal activities in cyberspace and its interference in other countries' democratic processes. Now, all of this poses huge policy challenges for the UK and for our allies. We are best defended when we are united in our response to this long-term challenge. The UK's military training operation in Ukraine and our 1,000-strong troop contingent in Poland and Estonia as part of the enhanced forward presence are strong signals of our commitment to collective defence. Now, Russia's actions present a serious strategic challenge for the West. It has required us to recalibrate our approach, focusing on defending ourselves and our partners and deterring the Russian threat. But it also requires us to engage in dialogue where necessary, partly in order to register our clear differences, for example, over Russian actions in Ukraine or Syria, and partly because we do have some shared priorities with Russia, such as countering terrorism and fighting climate change. Now, we judge that any policy response that unnecessarily magnifies that sense of them and us will only move us further from being able to solve these global problems together. So that is why the UK approach is, in the words of our Prime Minister, engage, but beware. That means engaging seriously and sensibly whilst making absolutely clear when Russia's actions are unacceptable and taking united action, and this unity is vital, taking united and robust action against it. What's at stake is no less than the credibility of the rules-based international order, the order on which European and international security as a whole depends. And that is why a concerted and strong international response to Russian actions is so very important. So we believe that sanctions against Russia should remain an important part of that response. Sustained EU, US, and G7 unity over sanctions sends a powerful message of our shared rejection of Russian actions and our determination that Russia should not be able to flout international law with impunity. The forthcoming passage of national UK sanctions legislation will ensure that the UK will be able to maintain its current sanctions once we have left the EU. And the UK is committed to continuing to play a leading role in shaping the international response to Russian aggression in Europe and elsewhere. But promoting our values is not just about security. It's also about enabling all people to live a life with dignity, free from discrimination and violence. And this principle underpins all of our human rights work at home and abroad, and human rights are an integral part of our foreign policy. It's now 70 years since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights stated that all are born equal in dignity and rights. And it's 50 years since being gay began to be decriminalized in the United Kingdom. Yet today, more than 2 generations later, people all over the world continue to suffer prejudice and discrimination simply because of their sexual orientation. And that is why the UK is committed to promoting and protecting the rights of women and girls and of LGBT people everywhere, and to building a wider international consensus around efforts to advance equality and justice. And that includes here in the US, because this is another area on which the UK government and the US administration do not see entirely eye to eye. We've made very clear that we oppose all discrimination, including within the armed forces. I know that our Consul General, based here in Chicago, has done a great deal of work to promote our Love is Great campaign, both here in Illinois and across the 14 states for which he's responsible, including participating in Chicago and Denver Prides and bringing over the London Gay Men's Chorus to sing with their Chicago counterparts a few months ago. We will continue to encourage all countries, including the US, to develop and implement policies that extend human rights and freedoms to all. Now I'm looking forward to a lively question and answer session in a minute. Challenge and debate is, after all, a fundamental tenet not only of healthy democracy, but also of academic rigor. So altogether that makes us experts in the art of the question. So I shall try to avoid the politician's habit of evading the answer. So perhaps I can conclude as I started by saying that the transatlantic era is emphatically not dead. The world faces ever more complex, costly, and dangerous challenges. And the answer is to be more international, not less, to turn outward, not inward. And that is what the United Kingdom will be doing once we leave the European Union. So in this global context, the relationship between the UK and the US, yes, the special relationship identified by Churchill all those years ago, is in my view needed more than ever. And I'm delighted to confirm that it is very much alive and kicking, and I hope working together for an altogether better world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we'll go out to the audience for questions. If you could please raise your arm, wait for the mic, and make sure your question's a question. We can kick it off now. Okay. Oh, there we go. Right there, please.
Thank you. I can't, personally, I can't help but think that a lot of current affairs going on right now, including Brexit, as well as the election of President Donald Trump here, Catalonia, the Scottish referendum. There's always rumbling in Texas that there's always talk of secession. So I can only think that in 5 or 10 years, the world is going to look a lot different. Borders will be a lot different. Citizens are continuing to feel like they can't really trust in the old order of things. So I was wondering if you can comment on some of those thoughts.
Yes, I mean, I think we're living through an extraordinary period where traditional parties, the party system, is under strain. People feel much more loyal to causes than they do to parties at the moment. And also, in many cases, the traditional nation state is under strain. That means we're living through a period of dangerous and challenging instability. And I think that one of the most important causes, if you like, or elements of foreign policy has to be to want to encourage and establish stability rather than risk instability. It's very important as part of the rules-based system I was describing to recognize and sustain the integrity of nation states. And therefore, I think that in the case of Scotland and Catalonia, it is right that they should only be permitted to have a referendum if the entire country from which they wish to leave has agreed to it. So in that sense, the Catalonian referendum is constitutionally illegal. And in the case of Scotland, they voted to stay part of the United Kingdom. So in those two cases, they are parallel, but with different outcomes and different settings, if you like. But you're right. I think that we are seeing, and it perhaps explains the Trump phenomenon, a mood of anti-establishment sentiment, particularly amongst younger people. But what politicians have to do through leadership is to try and overcome negativism and give people something to believe in by giving clear leadership and a clear sense of direction.
Thanks. Could you talk to us at all about do you think the Commonwealth does play a greater role? You mentioned it very briefly in your case for a global Britain.
Well, the Commonwealth is a mixture of countries, some small, some large, most all self-governing. And of course, Australia and Canada are very different from the smaller islands, for instance, of the Caribbean. So they have a common element in that they recognize the Queen as the head of state, but in other respects they are very, very different and are members of the Commonwealth, I would say, with some varying degrees of enthusiasm. So, but to think of them as a homogeneous sort of grouping which somehow are a single market or a single entity is to misunderstand the nature of the Commonwealth.
Okay, right over there, please.
How do you think that Britain is going to juggle the issues of human rights and immigration and cultural awareness? In other words, we've all got problems, and we're seeing problems throughout the country, throughout the world, with the desire to help people at the same time of conserving not just your values, but even your legal system. And I remember when one of the archbishops suggested that Sharia should be equal to common law in some domains. So I'm wondering if you can comment about where England is going on that issue.
There is one law in the United Kingdom, and that is the law made by Parliament. Full stop. What you hint at, though, when you mention immigration is a growing problem in the world, which is the mass movement of people, caused either by the magnetism of economic opportunity or by displacement caused by conflict. And these mass movements of people are some of the greatest problems we're having to tackle, particularly, for instance, in the Eastern Mediterranean, and where almost an entire population, that of Syria, has moved to other countries. So that is why we still need collective action. We need countries working together, why we need a rules-based international system which gives us a steer as to how people should conduct themselves. That is exactly the sort of reason for which Britain is not going to shrink and disappear down a hole and not play a part in the wider world. We will be playing our part in the wider world, perhaps even more so after we've left the European Union than while we're being part of it.
Yes, next question next to it, please.
Sir Alan, could you talk a little bit more about the economic and trade aspects of the British-American relationship that goes back to President Obama famously saying pre-Brexit that Britain was going to be at the back of the queue, and then President Trump saying that's not the case, and just recently you've had this big blow-up with Boeing and Bombardier. And does that suggest that the special relationship economically still has some bumps to iron out?
Well, I'd like to think there's no queue. And certainly going around the world, most countries I visit are very keen to have a free trade agreement with us. Some can perhaps simply replicate what any country might have with the EU at the moment. Others may need to be totally new and therefore involve quite a lot of detailed negotiation. When it comes to the US, we do massive flows of annual business, many, many tens of billions. And whether we need a free trade agreement or not will become clear. There is not one at the moment with the EU. Business is happening at the moment in the absence of a free trade agreement. If we end up having one after we've left, that may be all for the good and might enhance and expand the trading opportunities that we have in both directions. So a free trade agreement is not the answer to everything, but where one can be agreed and designed in a way that's mutually advantageous to the two sides, then that will be a benefit. So we do hope to have free trade agreements across the world, but the one that will matter, of course, enormously to us will be the agreement we have with the 27 countries of the EU itself.
Great. I'll take one of the questions from our audience that's coming in over our conferences system. How is the UK responding to assist its overseas territories in the Caribbean that were impacted recently by hurricanes?
Rapidly and effectively. We have 3 main overseas territories for which we have a measure of direct responsibility. And we have exercised that help. What we do in the hurricane season is pre-position a naval vessel full of stores, in this case, a Royal Auxiliary ship called Mounts Bay. And it was able to get into Anguilla very quickly, then on to the British Virgin Islands. Fortunately, the hurricane largely bypassed Montserrat. But for the ones for which we were directly responsible, we responded very rapidly. Mounts Bay was able to get the hospital up and running. It could do a survey with a helicopter. It went on to BVI, which was very hard hit, and helped people depart and brought essential supplies, water, quickly afterwards. So there was a lot of very active assistance brought in very soon after the 2 hurricanes. And we had an active crisis center in the Foreign Office, which brought together the Ministry of Defense, the Foreign Office, and the Department for International Development, which for over a fortnight was working round the clock to coordinate the logistics of this help. We've also given help to Dominica, where we are not directly responsible for them, but it was the right thing to do. So I'd like to think that the British response was effective, it was targeted, it was flexible, and it was quick.
Thanks. The Consul General of Chicago, Consul General Ito of Japan, the mic's right there.
Thank you very much. You mentioned 3 countries as a common challenge to US and UK, namely North Korea, Iran, and Russia. But how do you frame China into your strategic thinking, particularly when you pursue value-based diplomacy as well as rule-based order? So particularly in light of what China has been doing in South China Sea as well as East China Sea, is China not a sort of common challenge in the future, both to US and UK, or is China the, say, good economic opportunity? It's economic opportunity for all, but how do you see China in the light of the, say, strategic thinking?
You'll forgive me if I don't comment in detail on China, because it doesn't come under my sphere of responsibility. So I prefer to confine myself to the half of the world for which I am responsible, the 77 countries, which include Central Asia, Russia, and all of Europe and all the Americas. But I don't think it's right to put China into the same category as North Korea or indeed Russia. But of course, this is not a world which can be divided simply into goodies and baddies. There are countries which do good things, and in amidst doing good things also do some things that are matters we would object to. And clearly some things China does we do not approve of. But the key thing I hope at the moment is that on the massive issue of North Korea, they will exercise their influence to try and de-escalate and address the threat that is coming from Pyongyang.
Next question. Yes, the gentleman right there in the glasses, please.
I wonder if you can help me understand. It seems to me that the UK is sleepwalking out of Europe. The division was, what, 48 to 52, and the 48 haven't come back and said, you know, this is crazy. And can you explain what's going on in the UK?
Yes, very easily. It's called mathematics, and if it's more than 50%, they win.
Next question, please, from the audience. Yes, the lady right there, please.
Hi. I had a question about Iran versus North Korea. How do you think Iran would respond to its current agreement if North Korea gets its way and does develop a nuclear weapon? I mean, is that going to change how they perceive, well, they did it, why can't we do it?
Well, I'd like to think that they would see that it ends up being so much to the disadvantage of North Korea that they would realize that they are wise to continue with the course they're on at the moment in Iran.
Right here, please, in the third row, Caroline Craycraft.
I just want to go back to my friend's question back here. I don't understand why, on an issue with such an incredibly important outcome, there wasn't a requirement for a two-thirds majority. To have such an incredibly important issue solved by 4% majority just seems unbelievable.
I actually agree with you in principle that constitutional changes should have thresholds of some sort, either in terms of turnout or in terms of the percentage voting. And indeed, when we had our first referenda in 1979 on devolution, the threshold was that it had to be supported by at least 40% of those entitled to vote. So it was a sort of double threshold. And that is why it did not go through, for instance, in Wales. So, but it also caused a problem and a furious row between some politicians and the BBC, because some of the BBC reports were interpreted as saying, well, if you don't vote and stay at home, you won't get the 40%, so it's like voting no. So there was massive fury with the BBC in 1979. However, in this case, the House of Commons voted for a straight, simple majority on this issue in a referendum. But I think that your point about thresholds for constitutional changes is a very, very strong argument.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. Next question. Okay, we'll take another one from the online. How is the UK working with the US to counter the threat posed by North Korea's nuclear and missile programs?
So
How is the UK working with the US, if you can get into any specifics on that?
Well, I think I've covered that actually in my speech. I appreciate that the US approach to this issue at the moment is open to some interpretation, but certainly through the UN, we are working very closely with all countries to try and put maximum pressure on North Korea. And again, as I've said a number of times this evening, we must continue to work closely with China, who probably have the greatest influence over them.
There's also a question on here that I doubt you'll answer, but I have to try anyway since somebody put it in there. If you could comment on Boris Johnson's future in government?
Rosie.
Rosie. Okay. No Kipling poem for that. Any last questions before I know that the Minister has to head over to Navy Pier for an event this evening? Yep, one more there. Thanks.
So first of all, were you surprised by the Brexit vote? Sorry, I want to go back to that. Were you surprised at all?
Yeah. I was a Remainer. I thought, as I think most people who had political antennae, which they thought worked, thought it would be 52 Remain and 48 Leave. It turned out to be the other way round. The analysis of this will keep academics busy for a long time. But I think that the manner in which the campaign was fought stirred up a lot of sentiment amongst people who were not habitual voters, particularly on the issue of immigration. And I think you could feel in the last, I would say, 10 days of the campaign, and indeed I've got sort of emails to friends to prove this, that, as I put it, you could feel blue-collar, urban, traditional Labour opinion going viral for Leave. They were stirred up by an image of immigration which made them angry and made them throw a bit of a tantrum. There was a bit of anti-establishment feeling. I also think the campaign was badly conducted in that the then government under David Cameron and George Osborne very much hogged the campaign limelight, and it didn't look as though the Remain argument put a vision of optimism, and nor did it appear to be a cross-party endeavour. That made elements of voting opinion treat it as a verdict on the government of the day, which invariably sort of creates anti-feelings, and that converted into votes. And that I think explains part of the chemistry that led to the result. Yeah, I'll take
Go
another
ahead.
one. No, it's
Go
interesting.
ahead.
I'll take one more if I may. Yeah, go ahead.
One more, thanks.
Yeah.
So just a quick context, a Canadian who lived in Europe and ran a global business out of Chicago. And, actually a family in the UK. And I got to tell you, I worry about the situation. And I don't know if you could comment on it. I'm worried from a competitive economic view. To me, I was blown away. And I don't truly understand what are they expecting to get out of this? And how is it going to help them in 20, 30 years? I'm thinking of their kids or their kids' kids, not necessarily the next 2 or 3 years, which I don't think much will happen. But is it fair to be worried like I am? I'm not involved directly, but indirectly I see this. And I talked to some young people in London, and they are all confused by this. So anyways, anything you could do to help would be useful.
Given that those were very much the arguments I put in trying to persuade people to stay in the European Union, it would be hypocritical of me to say that that what you are saying has no foundation. But what that points to is that we have to make the most of what we are now required to do by the referendum to try and turn it into an opportunity and not a disaster.
And it's fair to add, Minister, that the young people overwhelmingly voted to remain, but they'll be the ones dealing with the consequences of this.
That is undeniable.
Yeah. Okay, Caroline, one
We're
last
just warming
quick
up, actually. I mean, I'm happy to give it a couple of minutes if you want.
Okay, great. Yeah, no problem. That's fine.
Unless
just have
I'm being screamed
watchers.
at by my staff. I think I'm all right, am I?
Yeah, go ahead.
I've got 2 minutes, okay.
You mentioned Labour, which one tends to think of as urban. How do you explain that the town with the highest percentage of Brexit, Boston on the northeast coast, 70% Brexit, is totally dependent...
This is our Boston, not your Boston, yeah.
My Boston, I'm English. Okay.
So sorry.
Totally dependent on Polish immigrant labour for their agriculture.
Well, that's one of the paradoxes of what happened, is that Lincolnshire folk, if you like, said, oh, they're coming and pinching our jobs. Well, they wouldn't do the jobs themselves anyway. So it's a slightly artificial sort of anger. But it is, I think, less worrying to our agriculture than it is to our health service and our care sector. So many of the labour problems which might follow from this could cause us quite a lot of damage.
Anything else? Yeah, the gentleman in the back row.
Last one, here we go.
Okay,
Gonna make it an easy one, here we go.
Yeah, I'm sure it will be easy. With the UK leaving Europe, I mean, you hear so much that France and Germany runs Europe, but there's so many other great countries there like Holland and Belgium. Do they really have a say, or is Europe, EU, really run by France? Will it continue, or will it be run by France and Germany, or is that just an incorrect perception?
No, I think Europe will face strains, if you like, irrespective of our having decided to stay or not, because the nature of the European model is going to have to change if it's going to compete. And I think that some of the newer members of the European Union and Eastern Europe are beginning to flex their muscles, Poland, countries like that, in a way that will not allow France and Germany just to dictate to the rest of the European Union what they want to happen in the EU. And of course, much of the decision-making requires unanimity or a qualified majority anyway. So although they are the largest components of the European Union, it doesn't mean that they can dictate unilaterally to the rest of Europe about how it will be run.
Just one, thank you very much for plugging our symposium that we're doing with our colleagues in Chatham House on Thursday. If you'd like to sign up for that, there's still spots available. It's on from 9 until 1. And we'll have about 14 speakers. It's going to be terrific on this exact topic and others. But now, please join me in thanking the Minister for his frank comments today. And thanks for making the Council stop. Thanks, we're adjourned. Good night.